Hello, everyone. My name's Isabel Mitchell, and I am a professional advisor working with schools in London and Hertfordshire. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kate Cotton. Kate is UNICEF UK's Senior Programme Specialist in Education. She has worked in the international development sector for more than 30 years, and her experience is grounded in classroom practice, having started out post-PGCE in a rural secondary school in Zimbabwe. So she will be talking to us today about the role that UNICEF plays in education around the world and the challenges that children face globally in accessing education. So I'll hand over to Kate. Thank you very much, Kate.
So good morning, everybody. Happy World Teachers' Day. It's a pleasure and an honour to be a speaker in your conference today. So just quickly to start with, the role that I have of Senior Education Specialist at UNICEF UK is really what I would say is a bridge. So it's a bridge between all of the functions that happen at UNICEF UK, so communications, fundraising, advocacy, and our global education colleagues. So global, regional level, country level colleagues. So I spend a lot of my time talking to our education teams, basically. Shall I just keep saying next slide after each one? Next slide, please. Sam saying yes. So Martin and the team asked me to start with a kind of introduction to my journey, how I came to be doing the job that I'm doing, and any excuse to put pictures of 3-year-old me. So I guess my journey started with 3-year-old me able to access early learning. So this is me at the age of kind of going to nursery school, and for me that meant I was starting school, ready to learn, statistically more likely to succeed in school. And I recognised that I had the right to learn, which many children really don't have, because early childhood provision globally is very unequal. And I'll talk more about that later on in my talk. And in many low-income countries, it's either unavailable or unaffordable. And what we know from early learning is it's really the foundation for equity. So it's a really strong focus for UNICEF. So that's me, 3. Skip a few years onto university years. Yeah, keep on the same slide. So university years, and I put this one in because I wanted to be photographed next to my favourite tutor, the person who inspired me, a man called Tom Davis, who taught a course called Theories of the Mind. And when he gave his lectures, students would come from previous years, they would be sitting in the aisles, the floors would be packed, because he was inspirational. And just because it's World Teachers' Day today, I wanted to kind of recognise and acknowledge all of the teachers and educators who inspire us. So I went on from that, as the introduction said, I went on from that to work in a range of different schools. So I started out with my teacher training in Nottingham, and you can see the picture down there on the left. That was me doing my teaching practice all those years ago. And I wanted to keep that photo in because I wanted to acknowledge that child in the red t-shirt down on the right-hand side. And as we've just seen in that video, children also inspire us. And this was a student who had additional educational needs, who I will never forget, and who had a profound impact on me and what I went on to do, and also how I think about the world. So I wanted to keep that one in there. And then I went on and I worked with all sorts of different schools. So I've got pictures there from teachers that I worked with in Sudan, Zimbabwe on the bottom right. And then I went on to work in different organisations. So I worked with Save the Children, I worked with VSO, and I worked in lots of low resource settings, so often without running water, without electricity. And I found that, you know, the teachers around me were incredibly resourceful, and as far as they were able, did a fantastic job of supporting children's development. Some of them trained, some of them less trained, And UNICEF as an organisation has a really strong focus on teacher development and continuous professional development. So I popped in a photo there about Diwali and put it next to the celebration of the battles of Shaka Zulu in Zimbabwe, just to remind myself really that learning is at the heart of all that we do. And like all of us here, that's a golden thread, wanting to see children thrive, wanting them to be resilient and to reach their potential. So let's go on to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about three important factors at the global level and really to sort of set the scene of the context for the big picture in education. There are three factors that are creating a perfect storm, which is really affecting the educational outcomes for children. The first is the underlying learning crisis. The second is the long impact of COVID-19. And the third is the funding crisis for the global education sector. All of these potentially harm children, and particularly those who are at the greatest risk for inclusion. So I'm going to start with the learning crisis. Even before COVID-19 closed schools around the world, we were already experiencing a learning crisis. So 53% of children were not learning. So that's basic literacy, not able to read a sentence by the age of 10. And post-pandemic, that's 7 in 10. And in crisis situations, it's 8 in 10 or higher. So there's a huge disparity again with disparities between rich and poor. There's disparity within countries and between countries, and there's a profound inequality there. We're very far off from achieving SDG 4. The education-related articles in the UNCRC, which we hold so dear, 28 and 29, but many of the others as well, are far from being achieved for many children. And what we say as UNICEF is that without urgent action, this global learning crisis is going to become a generational catastrophe. So we're focused on really trying to address that at the global level. So next slide, the long impact of COVID-19. So when the pandemic hit, at its peak, it disrupted education for hundreds of millions of learners right around the world. And all of us here will have felt that impact, whether it's for our own children, whether it's for the classrooms that we work in, or if we're working in kind of education administration systems. So at one point in the crisis, more than 9 out of 10 students lost access to school, and that has had really profound impacts on their learning. And what we saw is that many of the inequities that have kept millions of children from accessing quality education were further exposed. So things like negative coping mechanisms for families living in poverty, things like child labour, early marriage for girls, were further exacerbated, and more children lost out on school and stayed out of school subsequently. Millions of children also missed out on services. So services that are often provided through schools. So school is an entry point for things like nutrition services, immunisation, mental health and psychosocial support services and protection were withdrawn with the closure of schools, and that's had profound and long-term impacts on children. Next slide. So the third kind of meta level issue, I guess, is the funding crisis for education. So we urgently need investment in education, but the global financial landscape is pretty bleak, as we know. Learners have faced drastic education budget cuts at national and international level. So governments have prioritised spending elsewhere on domestic and regional needs, which means that education is missing out, the education sector, and the amount of aid is being reduced alongside the drop in economic growth at a time when households can't pay school costs due to their own financial challenges. So we've seen that with overseas development assistance. We've seen it in the UK, the drop in contributions to global ODA, and that's been replicated worldwide as well. So there are significant challenges in the financing of education. And that picture is even bleaker, actually, when it comes to education in emergencies, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So let me go on to the next slide. So we asked our global education colleagues to identify what the major challenges are that need to be addressed so that every child learns. And I'm not going to talk about all of these in depth. I'll just sort of touch lightly on some of them and go into a couple of them in depth. So these challenges, and I'm sure we can identify more, and I'm sure you as educationalists will add to this list as well. But these challenges range right across the lifespan. So that's from early learning to adolescent skills, and it focuses on the areas of greatest inequality for children. So the first one I mentioned earlier was about early childhood education. So only around 60% of children are accessing education at this vital stage of life at the moment. And again, there are huge disparities. In high income countries, that's as high as 83% or beyond. And in low income countries, it can be as low as 22%. So there is a really significant inequality there. And particularly in conflict and conflict affected and fragile settings, education in the early years is very rarely prioritised by service providers. So children are missing out on that real kind of foundational learning. Then we come on to talk about numeracy and literacy, so foundational skills. 502 million primary school children can't read a simple age-appropriate text and understand it by the age of 10 at the moment worldwide. And I think policymakers are recognising this, but they're underestimating the scale of it. So learning poverty is rife, and they haven't been able to prioritise investments in foundational literacy and numeracy, which is what we need to see to really accelerate learning in the primary years. Adolescent skills I'm going to come on to in a bit and talk a bit about my experience in Jordan and what I saw there in UNICEF's programmes. We're going to go on to girls' education. And I will say a proviso here that we talk about education for all children. So it isn't just about prioritising girls. And in some contexts, including our own, it's attainment for boys that we're really concerned about. So we're working right across the spectrum, but statistically, girls are less likely to be learning, particularly in the adolescent years. And they face monumental barriers to accessing quality education. So things like early marriages, violence, parents who are fearful for their safety and keep their girls out of school. They have household responsibilities. And where family resources are really stretched, girls are often deprioritised. And we've seen that in terms of access to digital learning in particular as well. But there is an economic argument really to invest in girls. How on earth these things get calculated, I don't know. But for every year of schooling that a girl has, it increases her future earnings by up to 20%. So there's a really significant economic argument, but there's also a social argument and a developmental argument for investing in girls, which is girls who are educated are likely to have their families later. They're likely to have fewer children, more spaced out. They'll have better health, lower neonatal mortality, and they tend to have more educated children. So there are really strong arguments for investment in girls' education globally. And actually that's recognised in the investments that many governments make, including FCDO. Digital learning, so a little bit on digital learning. I think as UNICEF, we would recognise it is a tool. It is not the silver bullet that answers all our educational ills and challenges, but it does have great potential to create societies that are both more inclusive and more prosperous. However, access is unequal. 2/3 of school-aged children don't have access to the internet at home. So there's a digital divide between those who can access and have the capacities to use these digital opportunities. So this digital divide is something that UNICEF is working on with providers, and we're also recognising the potential for frontier tech, so things like AI. Again, a double-edged sword, because if that AI is not inclusive, then we're going to be leaving many children behind. So I'm just going to skip disability as well, because I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. School environments. So this is another challenge. So there's often inadequate infrastructure in schools. So things like water and sanitation for girls. If they don't have adequate toilet facilities, girls often stay out of school. And also access for children with disabilities. If you don't have the appropriate infrastructure in place, then it's a barrier for children. The other thing about school environments, as I said earlier, it's often an entry point for services, but many schools don't provide that. And we have to look really holistically about the barriers that keep children out of school, which may include things like mental health. And often schools don't have the capacity or the resourcing to be able to address that. Education in emergencies is a huge area of work for UNICEF, and it's about half of our programme spending is on education in emergencies, and it's critical for a number of reasons. Firstly, because that's what children and families tell us is a priority. So when we ask them when they've got basic provision of things like health services, when they have safety, when they have access to water, the first thing that they're then asking is, what about school? What about education? Because it represents hope for the future. School is also protective. It can protect children from the physical dangers around them, including kind of abuse, exploitation and recruitment into armed groups. And it also provides life-saving food, water, healthcare, hygiene and supplies and things like that. And it offers mental health and psychosocial support. So what we find in emergency settings is often education is the first service to be suspended and the last one to be restored. And globally, the education sector receives less than 3% of humanitarian aid. So in all of the aid budgets that are provided for humanitarian settings, education gets a very small slice of the pie in terms of the needs that are there. Then briefly, I'm going to mention data, which I think a lot of you will be familiar with, but it means that we need to work on data collection, monitoring to be able to help policymakers to identify what's working, who's benefiting, who's being left behind. And we work very closely with ministries of education to strengthen their education management information systems. It's always a bit of a mouthful, their EMIS systems, as a priority, because if we know who's missing out, then we can target funding towards them and support services. So that's data. There's a couple that aren't in there, but I think are kind of integrated within some of them. One of them would be teacher workforce, which I've already mentioned. Having a trained and competent workforce as a priority with continuing professional development for teachers. The second one that isn't there but might be integrated within emergencies is about climate and climate change. So for UNICEF, what we're seeing is that there is a much greater need to integrate thinking about climate and climate change into education systems so that they're more resilient. So things like the El Nino events, flooding in Bangladesh, how do we make sure that schools can stay open, that children can keep learning? So we're having to think about that a lot at the moment. And also think about green skills for children. What do they need to know? How do we make sure that that education is relevant and is equipping them for the future? And it enables them to be resilient and also to access the green careers of the future. So as UNICEF, we work across all of those areas above. We focus on education systems, system strengthening, and we do that. We don't do that alone. We do it through partnerships. So partnerships with the private sector, also partnerships with community-based organisations, non-government organisations, and especially with ministries of education. So UNICEF operates in a country at the invitation of a government. So it means that our plans align with national education plans, And it means that we can address the very complex and interconnected challenges that we have in the education systems at scale. So that's really a kind of priority for us. Right, next slide. So I said I'd stop and kind of pause on a couple. I want to focus on disability issues in particular, because children with disabilities are often the least likely to access a quality education, which is their right. So by the time they reach upper secondary school, nearly all children with severe disabilities are out of school. And the widening inequalities that we're seeing mean that greater numbers of children, in their millions, about 240 million children, are going to be further left behind. Investment in inclusive education is often inequitable, it's suboptimal, and without quality education, young people, children and young people with disabilities are vulnerable to exclusion from employment. So there's lots of statistics around all of this, but I kind of recognise for us, it's almost like we use those statistics to influence policymakers, but it's often the stories that touch our hearts. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And just mention kind of what UNICEF is doing. So we're using that kind of data to influence governments and to support the development of inclusive and human rights-based policy and legislation, so that we have learners with disabilities at the centre. As I said, we're strengthening data and data systems, so we know who's missing out, why they're missing out, and we can target interventions. And we also work through partnerships, so things like with disabled people's organisations, to make sure that the interventions that we have as UNICEF are relevant, that they're appropriate, and that they're designed in the right way, and that they're well coordinated. And we innovate. And the next one is really, I guess, to bring this home a little bit. This is work that's been done. We've actually had a UK education supporter who has funded this work across Latin America and the Caribbean, which is about digital accessible textbooks. So this is using technology for more inclusive education. And I'm just going to let Ari speak for himself.
For children who are deaf or hearing challenged, that to be able to click on that icon and see the interpretation validates their language, which for many of them it's their first language and English is their second language. The Accessible Digital Textbook Project aims to harness the power of technology, innovations in technology that can increase the inclusivity, the ways in which learners with and without disabilities are able to engage meaningfully with content at home, at school, and in their communities. You have sign language, you have the voices, but you also have the ability to make the text bigger and smaller, and you have activities that are embedded. So it's taking the digitization of content to a higher, more inclusive level.
You don't want to be left behind, even as hearing groups. Even if all of us here, we are hearing and somebody is leaving you behind, you're going to feel sad. So everybody wants happiness. Everybody wants to move forward and be happy together.
So really, really lovely bit of work that's happening across Latin America and the Caribbean at the moment to make sure that all children are able to learn alongside one another. And actually this work's been really successful. We want to replicate it elsewhere. We're talking to governments in South Asia, we're talking to governments across the Middle East, and it really has the potential to go to scale. So it's a really, really amazing bit of work. I'm also very conscious that that video isn't fully signed and subtitled throughout, so I'll post a link which has a longer video which includes signing and subtitles. So that's a little bit more on our work with disability and some of the kind of innovations that we're seeing. So next slide is around adolescence. So we have all sorts of influences that are impacting. So technology, migration, climate change, conflict, pandemics are reshaping our society. And it forces young people across the globe to adapt to unexpected changes in their lives, and to their education, their access to education, the quality of education, and also to work as well. And what we're seeing is that many children and young people are entering adulthood without the full range of skills that they really need to enable them to navigate personal, social, and economic challenges. So again, there's some statistics there on the slide, but what we've really seen is that the pandemic exacerbated the learning and skills crisis for secondary level students as well, particularly those in humanitarian settings, but also more broadly as well. So there are many barriers that they face to developing the crucial skills that they need for life. So what this means for UNICEF really is to work with young people where they're at and put in place alternative flexible learning pathways, which will support their learning or transition into work, and that means including digital and accelerated things like accelerated learning and catch-up and bridging programs, so that we can bridge children back into mainstream education or onwards towards work. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about a visit that I made to Jordan earlier this year, and I got to see this kind of work in action. So I had the chance to visit programs in Azraq refugee camp. I also saw others in Amman as well. But what's interesting about Jordan is it has a very, very young population. It's one of the youngest in the world. 63% of its population is under the age of 30. But it has incredibly high unemployment rates. So it's about 42% for the 15 to 24-year-old age range, and even more so for young women who face multiple barriers to work. So when I went to visit Azraq refugee camp, you can see a picture of it there. It is in the middle of nowhere. It's quite far from Amman. The buildings are sort of serried ranks, as you can see, of white buildings, and it is very hot, it's very dry, and it's sort of desert conditions. There are huge numbers of refugees who are living here, some of them who have been born here and are growing up here, and it means that we really, really need to provide services that support children's learning and skills, but also provide hope, because one of the things we've seen with this generation of young Syrians, both in Lebanon and in Jordan, is that their mental health has been really severely affected. So we are working on social innovation programs so that we can support them to develop skills, whether that's business skills, project management skills, whether it's specific technical training, things like robotics, carpentry, coding, social media, things like that, so that they have a whole range of skills to enable them to be really, really adaptable and resilient. The next slide. So within that refugee camp, as I showed you, there were those kind of serried ranks, but there are spaces, UNICEF specific spaces that are being created, and this is one of them called a Makani Centre, and it's a safe space. You go into it, you know, there's grass, albeit fake grass, it's brightly painted. As I arrived, children were playing, there was a girls' football match happening. And they separate girls and boys learning. So I went in while there was a girls' session. And relating to the work that you all do, what I saw in the classroom was girls learning about their rights, and it was particularly focused on the protection of girls. And we were asking them about all of their rights, and they were very confident. All of those things that you said in your word cloud, it's the same kind of work that we're doing in the Makani spaces in Jordan. Girls were confident, they were able to speak out about things. And what we know from that is if they're better equipped, if they understand their rights, they're better equipped to be able to speak up. So whilst we were there, we were also able to visit early learning sessions. So these were for parents, which enabled them to support their children's cognitive and emotional development. So this is kind of really early years education for parents. So there's really lovely work that's happening right around the world. And I think I'll just mention here that within the refugee camp, there are all sorts of things that are happening. There are digital education classes, and we've particularly seen that that's important for girls because they're able to get online work and to do that safely from home. And just that picture on the right, if you could go back one slide. I just wanted to show you that picture of that young man. So there's a young man called Mohammed, and he's been through this process of supporting learning social innovation skills. And his solution was to build a solar powered bicycle to be able to carry water around the camp. And this was a particular problem that he'd seen in relation to his family, his mum and his sisters who were having to walk long distances. And actually, this was his prototype, this was his design, and it won global awards. And that in itself provided huge amounts of kind of hope for young people within the camp setting. And I guess one of the things that young people spoke about when we were there is what next? There's an anxiety there that we're learning these skills, but we know that employment isn't there for us. And they want more specialised training, they want to be able to further develop their expertise, but there isn't necessarily the funding to be able to do it. So we listen to the voices of young people, they influence the programmes that we design, and we are supporting them to become global citizens, as are you. And on that note, I'm just going to end with a couple of resources. If you could go to the next slide, great. So many of you may be familiar with this, but one of the global pieces of work that we do is work with UNESCO and the world's largest lesson to provide resources for teachers. So it has lesson plans, teacher guides and resources for children to build skills and motivation to take action on the Sustainable Development Goals. And every year we create campaigns and challenges, and all of that is available. I've put the link in there. I'm happy to share that afterwards. And it's encouraging young people to be advocates, to be informed and to be advocates for sustainable development in the long term. And then just last slide really is where to go if you want more. So I've put a few different links in here, happy to share these afterwards. But if you're ever looking for stories to work with children and you're wondering where the resources are, we have a whole section of UNICEF stories and you can search it by theme or topic. So you'll always be able to find kind of resources for your classroom. And we have various other reports and websites and data and a strategy that outlines what we do. So I just wanted to kind of give that bigger picture. I can see I'm getting lots of messages, questions that are emerging. I think I've got 10 minutes, have I, Martin? He's nodding at me. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes for Q&A, which is always a bit interesting when they come as written questions and I don't get to have that conversation to and fro, but let me just have a look. Okay, so there's one here. How can we as teachers in the UK make a positive contribution to global education? Is it awareness raising, fundraising? I would say all of the above and more. So I think part of that is supporting young people to become global citizens, as I've talked about there with things like the world's largest lesson, connecting me to we. So obviously starting with where children are at, and that kind of outward facing, increased understanding. But also fundraising as well. So encouraging young people to be global citizens by supporting education programs elsewhere in the world and supporting other children to achieve their rights. And what I would say on that is not just what's beautiful about the work that you do is that it's rights-based, right? So it isn't just a philanthropic message of, you know, children over there, you know, who deserve education. It's a fundamental right, and part of it is funding that supports programs that enables children to access their rights. Let me have a quick look in questions. Do you want to unmute any of the team that posted the questions? I'm trying to read them all through. Oh, there's one there. What aspect of the work UNICEF has done in the field of education are you most proud of? Oh, that's a really, really challenging one. I think at the moment I'm highlighting the work that we're doing on disability. I think the innovation work that we do in that space is amazing. But I think we need to do a lot more. I think it needs to be more of a priority in the work that we do. And I would like to see that in our education programs. I think in many cases, people are recognizing that and building it into their program plans right around the world. But I would like to see more of that.
And Kate, I was going to help you with some of the questions.
Sorry, I'm reading. There's a lot.
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions, and we'll not
Which is
have
great.
time to get round everybody. And I think that just it just shows the power of your presentation, Kate, and the work that's happening. A quick question that I think jumped out at me is it's similar to the question you've just answered, but what's the number one way that we as teachers and school staff can make a substantial difference?
Well, I think the starting point is what you're already doing in terms of becoming rights respecting schools and building that understanding, you know, from early years right through to secondary school about what rights are and that everybody has those rights. And I think if children grow up with that perspective, that's going to influence everything that they do in the future. So I think the work that you're already doing in building kind of global citizens and people that recognise that children right across the world have rights, I think that's one of the most important things you can be doing.
Thanks, Kate. Another one, which is a very challenging question to answer, but what do you think, what do you see as a priority for education in the UK?
I'm probably not the person best equipped to answer this question. And I would probably defer it to my rights respecting schools colleagues. So back at you.
Embedding children's rights into policies and practice. That's my suggestion, and hopefully Maxine will tell us a bit about that. Maybe a final question, Kate, before we finish, because I think we've got a few minutes. Are there any other programs around the world that focus on rights education, similar to Rights Respect in School Award, or is it more about improving provision?
It is both. It is both. So the child-friendly schools is an approach that UNICEF has had for many, many years and implemented in numerous countries around the world. And out of that grew programs like Rights Respecting Schools and others, and they're replicated in quite a lot of countries. Martin will know better than me which countries also have rights respecting schools programs, but a lot of them in higher income countries are similar to rights respecting schools, and the child friendly schools approach that we have in many countries sort of embeds rights into schools in a kind of holistic way as well. So I think, yes, I mean, it's the global work of UNICEF to kind of take on that work and embed it in schools.
Thank you. And maybe just one, I might squeeze one more question in. how could we, this is a question from a school, link pupils across the world for their common benefits, twinning schools through rights respecting or something similar, and that kind of touches on what you've mentioned around different countries being involved in rights education.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, my answer might not be the most popular one, but there are sometimes challenges with twinning initiatives between schools that we've seen in terms of expectations on both sides. I think when it's very thoughtfully and very carefully done, it can work. But we have found that if it's an inordinate amount of work, and to make sure that it's done appropriately and safely, you know, there are all manner of kind of safeguarding issues if you're trying to kind of twin schools globally. And I think there are many opportunities for learning that don't necessarily necessitate that. But I think there are examples where it has been done really successfully as well. But I think there's been a shift away from that. UNICEF doesn't facilitate that because, as I said, we're working really at the systems level. And, you know, we work on all of those issues that I've described around kind of policy, around funding, around teacher development, all of those things that we do. We don't specifically do that twinning of schools. There may be organisations that do.
Thanks, Kate. And I think that's really important. It's not as easy as just twinning with a school. That's not something that we can really be engaged with. It's something that needs to be really well thought about from an organisational perspective, from a safeguarding perspective, and from a policy and legislative perspective. If somebody wants to find out a little bit more about UNICEF's global work, where would you suggest they look, aside from the Rights Respecting School Award website? Do you have somewhere where you would point people to on the website?
So I do. So on the last slide that I had, all of those things had links. So there are links there. There's a UNICEF Global Education landing page. If you search UNICEF stories, you can find stories of programs. And yeah, I mean, the landing page for UNICEF Global Education leads you down all manner of rabbit holes of information, you know, whether you're interested is specifically in inclusive education, whether it's in adolescent education, etc., etc. So you can jump from there. And we do a global education annual report, which comes out every June or July time. So it's backward looking for the previous year. So in June 23, we report on all of the activities in 2022. And it's a huge and weighty report with many statistics and things, but it's useful to dip into to get a sense of what the programs are and what the priorities are if you're interested.
Fantastic.
Jerry, if I may jump in just before you conclude and thank Kate, I just want to pick up because Kate mentioned that I might have one or two responses to some of the questions. Firstly, on the one about sort of twinning and linking up with schools, I think as a team, we would 100% agree with everything that Kate said there. There are many challenges and many difficulties, and it's about the relationship between schools being genuinely reciprocal and contributing in both directions, and the learning being really authentically two-way. And as Kate said, UNICEF, both UNICEF UK and UNICEF globally, doesn't facilitate that type of arrangement. There is, however, in the UK context, or there has in the past been an arrangement facilitated by the British Council, and they at different times have had various schemes. And we would always encourage you as a rights respecting school to make rights the front and centre of any relationship you have with other schools globally. So that's a little bit of feedback on that one. And the other query about whether there are rights respecting schools elsewhere globally, many other UNICEF national committees are really proactive in looking at what are generally referred to as child rights schools rather than rights respecting schools. And there are certainly models of that happening in many European countries, but also further afield as well. And it's something that I think is a real movement that's growing over time. But many of those other UNICEF committees actually come to the UK to ask us questions and to help be inspired by the approach we've taken, because we've been doing this, I think, longer than any of the other UNICEF national committees. But there's a very collaborative group across the global UNICEF now who are really looking at child rights schools and the wider agenda of child rights education in its widest sense. So there's lots happening. So thanks for those questions. Back to Jerry.
Thanks very much, Martin. And I think I'm going to be made live at some point. Yep, I'm live now.